Okay, we're on Shabbat Perek Bet Mishnah Zayin. Last Mishnah in the chapter called Bama Madlikim. Mishnah concludes by giving us advice about how to enter into Shabbat, how to bring Shabbat in, what you should do on Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat. Says the Mishnah, Shlosha dvarim tzarich adam lomar b'toch beito Erev Shabbat im chashecha. A person should say three things in his house on Erev Shabbat. Im chashecha means right before. Look at the Bartenura, Keshu samuch lachashecha. Right before it gets dark. There's still time to take off ma'aser. Ula arei means and to designate food as your eruv. I'll just remind you in a second. What are the three things? Isartem, you're asking. And the Bartenura says you should say it nicely. Isartem, did you guys take off ma'aser? Eravtem, did you make an eruv? Hadliku v'taner. This is not a question. This is light candles. Make sure you light before Shabbat. So what's really fascinating is Isartem, we know is you're not allowed to take off maaser, as we're going to see right now. You're not allowed to take off. If I have produce that hasn't had trumot and maaser designated, it's you can't eat it on Shabbat, and to take it off on it's asur to take off produce on Shabbat, as we'll see in a second. Okay, Eravtem. Remember, we said everybody thinks that the eruv is the structure around the community, but it's not. The structure around the community transforms or it has the ability to transform a Carmelite, a public thoroughfare, or a semi-public thoroughfare, into a private domain, into a collected private domain. But the way you do that is, you have bread, you have food, okay, and you take the food and you say, this food belongs to, I am taking it and taking possession of it on behalf of all of us, on behalf of all the people in our enclosure, in my community. That's the eruv. And based on that eruv, then people are allowed to carry within the fence or the wall or the enclosure that we talk about. That's eravtem. So nowadays, we don't do it every Shabbat. Different people don't have the eruv in different people's houses. But rather, the rabbi usually does it on Erev Pesach for the entire year, and then we leave the food on the side. But back in the time of the Mishnah, that's not how they would do it. They simply would designate, I guess, each before Shabbat and say, okay, I have the eruv. The eruv is at my house. And they would come over and have shalashudis or whatever at my house. Okay, so that's the three things. Isartem, Iravtem, Hadliku v'taner. What's beautiful about it is the Mishnah clearly tells us that before Shabbat comes in, you have to prepare. You have to ask the right questions. So nowadays, we just translate simply to, did you set the Shabbat clocks? Did you turn off the lights? Did you make sure, I don't know, that your alarm clocks are off? And in Israel, we have these really weird hot water heaters. So last Shabbat, we had a big problem because we left the hot water heater on boil. And before Shabbat, you have to turn it to the Shabbat status. Why in Israel they can't come up with the more American kind? I don't know. Business idea. Nonetheless, all these questions, make sure you're ready for Shabbat. And also you have to do it, interestingly enough, tzarich lemenu b'nichuta. Say it nicely. Ki hechi dilekablu minei. So people will accept it. You say, everybody can't start on screaming, hey, Shabbos is coming, who turned off the lights, blah, blah. Unfortunately, we probably do that too much. You have to remember, lememrinhu b'nichuta. Okay. Safek chashecha, that's all before darkness, before what we call shkiyat hachama, before sunset. Safek chashecha, safek ein chashecha, if it's maybe dark and maybe not, if you're in doubt, and this is what we call, what is that called? Mitchilat shkiyat hachama, from sunset, kol zman shnira kochav vadayomu, as long as you can see one star, it's vadayom. Kol zman shnirim shnei kochamim beinoniyim, if you see two middle stars, that's Safek Hashecha, the Karui Bein Hashemashot. We don't paskin this way. Halachically, we paskin after Shkia, that's already the beginning of Bein Hashemashot. That's 18 minutes after candlelighting is Shkia, and then we treat it like Bein Hashemashot. But the Bartenura is much more makil, it's much more lenient, and says, even after Shkia, as long as you can see only one star in the sky, then you're still not even at Bein Hashemashot. Okay, but once you get to Bein Hashemashot, you place on it the stringencies of both the day and the night. So you have to worry, maybe it's a day, maybe you worry it's a night. So what are the implications? Says the Mishnah, if it's Bein Hashemashot, ein ma'asir et havadai, you're not allowed to take off maaser on tevel vadai, ve'ein matbilin et tekelim, nor if you have kelim that are tameh, you can't tova them. Why can't you tova them? Okay, ein ma'asir et havadai, tikun ma'ayo, it's a tikun. Okay, even though it's only afagav de eino elamishum shvut, it's a din d'Rabbanan. Kasavar high Tana, the Tana made feels Gazu al hashvut af bein hashmashot. We're going to talk about this in a minute. The Chazal made a gzeira on shvut, on dinei d'Rabbanan, even bein hashmashot, which is an interesting question that we'll come back to. Why ein matbilin et hakelim? Have kimitaken kli, because you're fixing a keli, and obviously ve'em malikin et neirot, and you cannot light neirot. You can't light Shabbos candles because Shabbos candles, that's a d'oraita. So if once bein hashmashot came, if you missed lighting candles after shkia, nowadays you can't light the candles. Aval ma'asrin, that's demai. Demai we've learned in many cases. In Masechet Demai we've learned before. Demai is produce yubafim min ha'aretz. Most Amei Haaretz took off Maasrot. Some did not. So we made a gzeira that maybe they didn't, and you have to take off Maaser on Demai. You have to take off Truma. You have to take off Maaser and then give Trumat Maaser to the Kohen. That you are allowed to do because it's a suffix. Because maybe they did. Ume Arvin, you can designate the Eruv. V'tomnin etachamin. We're going to learn what this means. So let's learn why Ma'arvin. Ma'arvin you're allowed to. Eruvei chatzerot, not eruvei tchumin. You can't go and do an eruv tchumin. You can't go walk out to the tchum because that might be a deoraita. But you can do eruvei chatzerot. The chumra be'almahu, because it's a chumra that you can't do it on Shabbat. Okay, but before Shabbat you have to do it. Avalo eruvei tchumin diyesh la'samech mikrai. Eruv tchumin might be an issue of deoraita. It's you have a smicha from the Torah. You have a hint from the Torah. V'tomnin etachamin, and you're allowed to do hatmana bein hashmashot. We're going to learn in Perek Daled what hatmana is. Hatmana basically is insulating your food. Okay, so there's two types of insulation. There's insulation b'davar shemosif hevel, with a fuel source that has heat, or b'davar she'eno mosif hevel. So you're not allowed to do hatmana even before Shabbat with something that adds heat. That's prohibited, d'Rabbanan. Okay, but with something that's eno mosif hevel, if it doesn't add heat, you are allowed to do it before Shabbat. You're allowed to, let's say you have food that's steaming hot, you can take it and insulate it in a cooler or whatever so it'll stay hot. That's hatmana. Okay, even though, why? The ilu davar mosif hevel, if it's mosif hevel, if you put it in the cooler with a heating element, even before Shabbat it's prohibited. Why? So then why are you allowed to do hatmana bein hashmashot? Shelo asul hatmin etachamim b'Shabbat atzmo b'davar she'eno mosif hevel. The reason that they prohibited doing hatmana on Shabbat, even if there's no heating element, is gzeira shema yimsa k'dei rato shenitztanara. Maybe the food will have cooled off. V'yarti chena ba'ur, and you're going to boil it. You're going to warm it up because the soup is cold, the cholent is cold. What am I going to do? I can insulate it, but it's not warm enough. Ubat bein hashmashot leka lemigzar b'hachi. By bein hashmashot, we're not worried about that because we assume stam k'deirot bein hashmashot b'otchonhem. We assume that they're already hot because it's just bein hashmashot. You just took that off the fire. You just finished warming up the soup. So therefore, you can do hatmana b'davar she'eno mosif hevel bein hashmashot, but davar she mosif hevel you can't do even before or on Shabbat. But on Shabbat itself, you cannot do hatmana even if there's not mosif hevel. This is got to have a chart. What do you know? Through the magic of time lapse, I'm able to make a chart. So as we learn hatmana, okay, the hatmana, which means insulation, in order to preserve heat. So we said, b'davar she'eno mosif hevel, if there's no additional heating element that's attached, erev Shabbat, you're allowed to do hatmana. Bein hashmashot, you're also allowed to do hatmana because remember, we assume your food is already boiled. It's still hot. On Shabbat itself, it's asur because maybe it'll not be hot and you'll heat it up. Davar shemosif hevel, if it has an added heating element, for sure on Bein Hashemashot and Shabbat you can't because you can't touch the coals. But even erev Shabbat, you're not allowed to do hatmana b'davar shemosif hevel for the simple reason, maybe you're going to stoke the coals, as we'll see later. Final issue, as we've said before, I just have to bring this up. There is an issue. We talked about safek chashecha, and we said these are issues of d'Rabbanan. And the Bartanura said about ma'aser and tvila. Ma'aser etadvai, la'aser etavadai. It's only an issue of d'Rabbanan because of it's a shvut. So why isn't Bein Hashemashot a problem? Why Bein Hashemashot is a suffix, remember we said. And if it's a din d'Rabbanan, then it should be mutter to do a d'Rabbanan in the case of suffix d'Rabbanan the kula. So the Bartanura addresses this by saying, Gazur ala shvut Bein Hashemashot. They made a gzeira on this shvut, even Bein Hashemashot. But the Bartanura only begs the question, why would they be gozer on a shvut if it's Bein Hashemashot, if it's a suffix? So the Gemara brings it up, brings this issue. I saw a shir on the Gush website, the Haratzian website. And one of the things that the person who wrote the shir, Rav Avraham Stav, writes is, the Rambam talks about this. And the Rambam says the following, it's important to note. Kol dvarim she'im asurim mishum shvut, If it's an Isur D'Rabbanan, lo gazir aleim Bein Hashemashot. The Chazal never made a Gzeira D'Rabbanan Bein Hashemashot. Ela be'atzmo shel yom hu she'ein asurin. But it's only Asur on the day itself. Which is interesting, because we never do this. Once we light candles, we don't do anything. We never say, wait, is that D'Rabbanan? Is it not D'Rabbanan? Except there are exceptions. Amira l'nachri is mutar Bein Hashemashot, etc., etc. Okay, but the Rambam then says, if so, then how come we don't do certain things? Why does our Mishnah say it's not okay? The Rambam says, im lo hayasham dochak v'lo dvar mitzvah asur. Okay, therefore, you are allowed to do things mishum shvur Bein Hashemashot unless it's not dochak, it's not pressing, or it's not a dvar mitzvah. Then it's not asur. Lefikach, therefore, ein masrin atavadai Bein Hashemashot. Like the Mishnah said, what our Mishnah said, ein masrin, is even though Hafrashat Maaser is only D'Rabbanan, nonetheless, it's not a Dvar Mitzvah and not a Dochak. The problem I have with this is, how did the Rambam know? Maybe you had no other food to eat. What if you really needed it? What if it was Dochak? That's how the Rambam solves this problem, but it leaves us in a question. Why, if it's only a Shvut, did the Mishnah say, Ein Masunet Avadai, Be'ein Matbilin Atakelim? What if I really need them for Shabbat? All right, I've gone on way too long as usual. I'm sorry. These Shabbat Mishnayot are they're chock full, and I feel like there's some things I have to share. And I apologize if it's too long. Oh, what can you do? Email me at artspolter@gmail.com. Tell me why the Rambam says what he does. I know it's a deeper sugya, and we'll dedicate the learning to the memory of my father, Rav Simcha ben Yitzchak Kalman. Have a good day.